everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Nostalgia Trap podcast. My name is David Parsons. I'm very excited that you are listening to the show and downloading the show and perhaps even sharing it with your friends, or at least the people you pretend are your friends on social media. Hi, how are you? I'm happy to join you. My guest today is someone who's a writer and a journalist. She works freelance, but I've seen her work. I swear her writing appears in every left website I go to. I've seen her on The Guardian, Alternet, In These Times, Salon, and probably most prominently on Dissent Magazine, where she hosts a podcast called the Belabored Podcast, which is about labor, surprise, and left politics in general. And that's a great show she hosts with Michelle Chen over there that you should definitely check out. I think people who listen to this program would like that one as well. So that's Belabored Podcast with Sarah Jaffe and Michelle Chen on dissentmag.com. So Sarah and I talked about a whole wide range of things. We're nearly the same age, so we talked a lot about kind of coming up in the 90s, what that culture and politics was like, what that landscape of politics was like, and how she developed into a journalist that tackles capitalism through specific stories. She's working a lot on Ferguson lately, so we had quite a talk about Ferguson, but we talked about feminism, we talked about Beyonce, the NFL, all sorts of stuff, and even tried to avoid talking about Hillary Clinton as much as possible because we have years and years to do that, and as Sarah pointed out. So this was a fun conversation. I hope you enjoy it. You can find more episodes of The Nostalgia Trap on iTunes. You can go to nostalgiatrap.libsyn.com to find all the episodes. Stitcher.com has all the episodes as well. And if you go to Facebook, your old Facebook page, crank the Facebook machine up and find The Nostalgia Trap on there, like the page, and you'll get updates on new episodes and all sorts of fun stuff. So thanks again for listening to the Nostalgia Trap podcast. This is my conversation with freelance writer and journalist Sarah Jaffe.
Republican parents, this is a thing, but you know what? I listened to a lot of punk rock and I had a lot of shitty jobs. It's always my sort of go-to answer on this question.
Punk rock and shitty jobs sounds like a great title of a memoir about finding the left.
Someday when I've done something interesting enough to warrant a memoir.
Well, are you from New York City?
No,
originally?
I'm from outside of Boston originally.
Okay.
And there's a whole strain of Boston punk rock, especially in the 90s, that is singing about your bar and your union or
is that right?
Oh yeah, the Dropkick Murphys, or the Dropkick Murphys got really famous.
Right.
But back in the I moved away from Boston in 96. So, back in the good old days, there was this whole strand of sort of, working class Irish Boston punk rock that literally was singing songs about unions. And the Dropkick Murphys' original singer quit to go become a Boston firefighter for a while and then started another band called the Street Dogs.
It's funny that whole cultural history, because when I came to hearing the Dropkick Murphys, when I think about that in high school and hearing that music, it was embraced by obnoxious Irish, very pro-Irish dudes that weren't really they were very removed from their Irish heritage, but for some reason still very much embraced it.
Yeah, it's very funny because it got. Yeah, I mean, the Dropkick Murphys in particular, is a weird thing, right? Now they play it Bruins games and stuff. And I am a hockey fan, so I, am pro these things.
Right.
But yeah, it is very funny and sort of removed from this dirty sort of Boston.
Yeah, I just mean the politics are kind of excised out of it.
Yeah, no, it really is a thing that was I think is very different from how it felt being a teenager sort of taking the red line in from the suburbs into Boston on the weekends. So
was that your life where you were a suburban person growing up?
Yeah. I lived in Canton, Massachusetts. My Massachusetts accent will totally come back in weird places when I start talking about this
and
too.
especially around your family, right?
Yeah. And I have family that's still in the Northeast, although they're mostly in New Hampshire, which is New Hampshire. My uncle had a cat named Chowda.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a whole other thing.
Did he spell the accent in the name?
No, but they sure said it. Yeah.
So what were besides punk rock and shitty jobs,
that is totally my memoir.
Where does it come from? Did you have teachers, or was there a particular person that brought the politics to you, or how did you kind of like fall into that?
God, I feel like being a teenage punk, and especially once again, like in the 90s when like there was sort of the nascent global justice movement happening, right? The WTO happened my sophomore year in college. I didn't go. I know people who went.
That's you're talking about like the '99 battle in Seattle,
right?
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. That comes up a lot on that show because I feel like people that were. When did you graduate high school?
98.
98. Okay, so we're very close in age, and it feels like the '90s were like. There was something happening in the 90s politically.
And it really was like I was a little too old for Riot Girl. So I kind of discovered Riot Girl like in college after most of those bands really no longer existed. And yeah, I wasn't involved in a lot of political stuff in college. Some friends and I protested a frat party that was themed the beaver hunt. That was kind of fun.
Oh God.
Yeah. Tulane, man. Tulane frat parties. It's
funny because it's like if you ever want to like just find like gross misogyny, it's almost it's like at this point it's kind of a cartoon. Just like go to the frat house and something appalling is happening.
Well, and like it really is this whole thing that like earlier this year there was this whole like sort of feminist debate over whether we should get rid of frats and this whole renewed interest in campus rape. And yeah, it is almost like they do make themselves such an easy target because good Lord, you're reveling in it.
Well, it's kind of perfect because it's adolescent, and it's like
it's adolescent
like it's young,
and it's
youth.
very entitled when you're talking about a lot of these campuses, right? I went to Tulane. I actually didn't graduate from Tulane, but I went to Tulane and there was a huge frat culture, and it is these sort of well-off white guys who basically come to school to party. My cousin's kid was actually asking me about this the other day because he's thinking of applying to Tulane, and he was like, "Oh, are there like a lot of frats?" And I'm like, "Are you saying that because you want it to be a good thing or a bad thing?"
Right. It's funny how little I thought about it growing up. Because I went to UCSB, which is Santa Barbara. I mean, a ridiculous school known for this insanity, and I didn't really cross my mind before I went there, and I definitely became a person that was. Positioned myself far from whatever that was, but it was still kind of like I didn't really consider how deep that culture impacts every part of the school experience.
Yeah. And I spent so little time on campus. Like I mentioned, I didn't graduate from Tulane. I actually transferred to Loyola New Orleans because I love New Orleans. I had all these friends in the city. I was working at a bar in the French Quarter, at a sort of tourist trappy jazz club for a while.
Was that a shitty job?
It was a shitty job.
Yeah.
My boss was a terrible person. It was a shitty job. But yeah, and so I had this whole life that was really not connected to campus, and that sort of includes campus activism, other than, like I said, this one frat party that we crashed my freshman year, which was the only year I lived on campus, and so the only time that any of that stuff was connected. So I remember the USass kids taking over a building to protest sweatshop labor, producing, Tulane branded apparel. I remember all of those things happening, and I was very disconnected from them. And I sort of just stumbled into politics sort of slowly and back and forth from reading Marx and taking a Marxist theory class my freshman year. I like to joke with people on Twitter that no, I actually didn't take Econ 101. I was too busy reading Das Kapital.
Yeah, right.
But I didn't sort of get involved in organized left politics really at all. And other than being in a punk scene that
it sounds like
is sort of identifies itself as being radical left, whether or not it actually is.
Right. It sounds like music. MTV. I think about it a lot in terms of the 90s because it was an entryway into there were politics on him. I remember the battle in Seattle being on MTV and Tom Morello talking about it, and there was this kind of I don't know if they do that anymore on MTV. I haven't turned it on in a long time.
I haven't watched MTV. I think that's all reality shows now, isn't it?
Yeah, that's what I think has happened.
I haven't had cable since
neither.
I moved out of my parents' house.
Yeah, I wonder what's going on in the culture, but I don't think it's that. I mean, I don't know if MTV is in Ferguson right now doing explaining what's going on. But it seems like the MTV of the 90s would have been. You know what I mean?
I guess. I mean, I don't know. I feel like popular music in the 90s was a little bit more political, right?
Yeah.
Like I remember that, whereas now we sort of there's plenty of political music out there, but it's not on the radio.
Right,
and like,
right.
I mean, Beyonce's performing in front of a feminist sign, and I am Team Beyonce like till death. But
why? What do you? Can we talk about that?
Thing.
What is? I mean, I see that, and I'm like I'm not a big like Beyonce, Jay-Z fan for a lot of different reasons. And I'm sure they're the same reasons that you might have some skepticism about these people. But what was that like? That she performed. Where was it that she performed?
I kind of think Beyonce's trolling at this point because she can do whatever the fuck she wants.
Right.
Beyonce has the male gaze locked up in a room in her building. Like, did you ever read that story in, I forget, maybe, oh God, I don't remember. GQ? I don't know. Somewhere. Did this cover story on Beyonce, and it was all about how she owns every recording that is ever made of her. If you want to interview Beyonce, you can bring your camera and point it at her, and she's going to point a camera back at you. And like, I love that. That makes me so happy. I took a bunch of film studies courses as an undergrad, and like, I'm just like, Beyonce may not have ever read Laura Mulvey, but like, she knows,
right?
And so I find her fascinating on that level. And also, I've gotten old enough to not really give a crap about silly punk ideas of authenticity that I will be a sellout if I listen to popular music. And the latest Beyonce album is really good.
So how is she engaging the idea of feminism? Because like, you're someone who's written about feminism, and it feels like a different
honestly, mostly I don't care if Beyonce calls herself a feminist. Like, I think we spend a lot of time obsessing over who calls themselves a feminist.
Yes.
And actually, I'm going to plug my friend Andy Zeisler, the editor of Bitch, who I just found out is writing a book on how feminist became an identity and how capitalism shaped that. And I have not read a single word of it.
Are you that or are you not?
Right, exactly. And like, actually, I think Sarah Nicole Prickett did a not even really a piece, but just a collection of all of these articles about like, is Taylor Swift a feminist? Is Beyonce a feminist? Is this one? And just collected all of these links and put it in one piece. They posted it at the New Inquiry. And it's just like, can we stop?
Yeah.
And like, I Bell Hooks argued a long time ago that instead of saying I am a feminist or I am not a feminist, we should say I advocate feminism.
Right. Yes.
That it should be placed on the actions. And I think of this especially not in relation to Beyonce, because Beyonce can be whatever the hell Beyonce wants to be. But like,
she's got
men
the male
who
gaze
call themselves
locked up.
feminists and people who, sort of white people who call ourselves anti-racist, things like that. Like, we sort of assume that I am a feminist, so I can't be a sexist douchebag. And it's like, you're still a man, and you still grew up with male privilege, and you still operate in a world where like, you can't extract yourself from that. And I grew up white in a mostly white suburb of Boston, and it took me a long time to actually realize things like the fact that, like, walking down the street in this neighborhood, the cops are never going to harass me, but they're going to harass my neighbor who's lived here since 1970, whatever.
Right.
Because he's black.
Yeah.
Even though he belongs in this damn neighborhood, and I'm the one who's just moved in.
Well, yeah, I think you're right, and the way we talk about this stuff has an impact on the way it moves, because when you talk about, like, the way I see it is, like, lately there's been this kind of like litmus test around cultural production. So it's like when Gone Girl comes out, all the questions are like, that ontological thing. They're like, is it a feminist work or is it a misogynist work? As if it's just that simple. Right. And once we label it that, then we can, draw those assumptions all the way down.
Well, I think we just, and this is a thing that also I think I have very little tolerance for, because I got annoyed with it in the punk scene, was like this idea of purity.
Yeah, authenticity.
And this very specific need for us to be able to sort of purify ourselves and claim that we are pure. And like, once upon a time, Lily Barana said to me, she's like, it's really easy to be super pure peace punk when you're still 16 years old and living at home, and you don't have to have a job and make a living. And like, in reality, we all make a lot of compromises living under capitalism, and we all make a lot of mistakes coming to politics, and I'm sure I've made tons of them and will continue to make tons of them, and hopefully I'm just smart enough to realize when they're mistakes and learn from them. And that's all I can think of in terms of what I want out of the job I do, which is kind of weird and horrifying and great.
Well, speaking about the weird, horrifying, great job that you do, yeah, I mean, you're a journalist.
I am a journalist.
You're a writer,
yes.
and like, when did that impulse start? Did you write for this high school newspaper? Were you that person, or when did you start to like kind of engage in current events, if you want to call it that?
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting question. I did write for high school newspapers. I wrote for literary magazines. I wrote short stories and things and had this brilliant idea that I was going to be a fiction writer, which along with a lot of other things realized at some point that no, I actually have to pay the bills. I don't have a trust fund. And
I hate when that happens.
Yeah,
when you're born without a trust fund.
It sucks. Like, there's no trust fund and we don't have a universal basic income. So damn it, I have to get a job.
Yeah, and
I didn't ever have this idea that I was going to be a journalist forever and ever. And even like I went to grad school in 2007, and even when I applied to grad school, I applied to some MFA writing programs.
Was it at Sarah Lawrence?
No. I applied to, I almost went to UT Austin, and I did not go to UT Austin, in part because I would have had to teach English 101 at UT Austin, and I thought, wow, that's a terrible plan. I do not want to do that. One thing I definitely knew I did not want to do is teach.
Yeah.
I do not have
You're talking to a teacher, so watch it.
I write a lot about teachers and their labor because I am continually impressed with people who do jobs that terrify me.
Yeah.
I'm just like, wow.
Well, it sounds like writing horrifies you in some way, too.
Writing is horrifying. Writing is constantly horrifying.
So where did you end up going to graduate school?
I went to Temple in Philadelphia, which is a wonderful working class journalism school where I was lucky enough to have some really fascinating sort of radical professors who, were interested in more than teaching us how to be objective journalists who wrote for the New York Times.
So you were in a journalism program at this point?
I did actually go to a journalism program.
Nice. So that's what I was curious
almost sort of
about,
accidentally, but yeah, I did go to journalism school and I did love it. So shout out to the Temple MJ program. They love when I do this, and I do genuinely think it was great. There are a lot of things you still don't learn in journalism school, mostly how god-awful the business is and how little money you'll ever make. But Temple was much more real about that than I think Columbia is, for instance.
By that, do you mean, I mean, it's kind of a cliche at this point to talk about how media is shifting and journalism and print journalism is changing. And was that like on the surface of your graduate school experience? Were people talking about that?
Yeah, they were. There was definitely, I had a couple of professors who were people who had worked in the industry for a long time, one in magazines, one in newspapers, who really, were aware of the fact that the world they were going to turn us loose into was not the one that they had worked in.
Right.
And tried their best to actually expose us to that. And there were other professors who actually were very interested in both sort of academically studying new media and also practicing it.
Yeah.
And they've actually brought me back to speak to a couple of classes sort of since then about why and how to use social media as a journalist. And God, dog, really? Is that necessary?
We've got another guest in the room that likes chewing on bones.
Yes.
And is a dog. I think you can guess that.
Yes, that is my dog. If you follow me on the internet, you have probably seen pictures of my dog.
Oh.
Now you've heard noises from my dog too.
Now he's getting shy.
Never.
So, how did you transition from graduate school into writing for all these different publications?
I was a Nation intern. I am a member of that illustrious family. I was an intern at the Nation Magazine the summer of 2009, which was fun. Actually, speaking of social media and journalism, I remember getting into a fight with one of my co-interns the first day about Twitter and whether it was good for anything. And 3 days later, Iran blew up. And that was the green revolution, and everybody was retweeting everything from Iran, and everybody had their Twitter avatars green. And I remember people coming in and going, oh, Twitter might be good for something.
And you were right.
And I was like, thank you, dude. Thank you. Your Columbia degree is so helpful, dude.
Yeah.
No idea what happened to that guy, by the way.
Hopefully he's tweeting somewhere. We can probably find him.
Hopefully he's listening to this and feels really bad.
It sounds like a mansplaining incident.
There were so many of those. They don't get any better the more sort of work you do and the more you can prove yourself to be whatever the hell.
You know what I think is really fun and like kind of takes it to another level, another like meta level, is to like for me to like explain to a woman what mansplaining is.
Oh,
you know
yeah,
what I'm saying?
that's
like,
always good too.
There's
Yeah,
lots of
no, there is like
it's a
there are so many
multi-leveled conversation.
There are
then.
so many levels to that shit.
So you know, you work at Dissent Mag. It seems like your Dissent Magazine is your main.
So yeah,
place.
I do a podcast for Dissent.
Yeah.
About labor issues with Michelle Chen, and we talk about the labor movement. It is now it's bi-weekly, so I do a lot of other writing in between there. And I guess I'm supposed to mention to the world that I'm writing a book. That's a thing that doesn't quite feel real yet, but
yeah,
at some point it will have to be, because
you have to just
I have a
say
deadline.
It.
I am writing a book.
What's your book about?
My book is about social movements since the financial crisis. I am going to explain to everyone why we got the Tea Party and then we got all of these other things and what is happening next.
I love that. Can you help me? Can you help me understand that? Because how much does it have to do with? It's a combination. To me, if I had to guess, and I'll see if I'll just play devil's advocate and see if I'm totally wrong. It's a combination that's kind of created this kind of explosion of social movements in the United States. It's the internet. It's social media. You just said that one. I know you're going to talk about that.
Yeah.
Then there's Obama's election in 2008 and the kind of like disappointment in what turned out to be his kind of overarching set of policies. And then the third one would be the financial crisis, right?
I do think you're right. I actually wrote a piece during sort of Occupy about how the Obama generation was sort of affected by the financial crisis and sort of the failure of hope and change, basically.
Yes.
Right? Like, we were talking about the 90s, right? And both
Mm-hmm.
of us grew up in this time period where, like, there sort of wasn't much of a left. And then, the WTO protests happened and stuff, but, like, there wasn't this big organized thing. And all of the presidential elections that the first presidential election that I could vote in was the year 2000. Y'all remember that. Mm-hmm. It was terrible and so depressing. And then 2004 was in many ways even worse, because we thought we were actually going to be smart enough to undo the colossal screw up that was 2000.
Well, 2000 had the Supreme Court making the decision, which I think was like a massive blow to like a whole generation of young people feeling like their vote had any meaning at all.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it drove a lot of us to becoming, crotchety lefties. And I think that is laying dormant too. But this generation that is a little bit younger than me, right? There's, a whole bunch of people now who like edit my pieces who are, 10 years younger than I am, who their first exposure to political anything, to mainstream U.S. politics, was Obama. Yeah. And that was like they won.
Right. Yeah.
And
that's really interesting.
That's a totally different sort of feeling of engaging with politics. And then like they won and that didn't do anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's a different thing than like we worked really hard and we lost and so bad things happened.
Yes.
Then like we won and it didn't get us what we want, so we're going to have to win something else. And winning something else now has opened up into all of this stuff that is, young people that I talked to last week in the Ohio Students Association who like occupied a police station because they want the police officer who shot John Crawford in a Walmart for carrying a toy gun that Walmart sold to be arrested or fired or some sort of consequences other than like desk duty to happen to this guy who shot this kid. Or what's going on in Ferguson or Occupy or largely a lot of young people who are part of the Fight for 15. Right? That all of these things are happening because several things, shifted in how we think about how we do politics. And I think the financial crisis just like blew up everybody's idea of the system, right? That our political economic system at all was like, oh, wait, this is a thing. And we're realizing it's a thing because it collapsed. And we realized it can end because it almost did. Yeah. And because
it makes me wonder, because I know presidential politics that have played too much of a role in our overall political culture.
Yes, they do.
But at the same time, do you feel like the Bush years were like kind of like threw things off track a little bit for the left in terms of like.
Absolutely.
I mean, it just seemed like he was just like this lightning rod for everything.
Well, right, and it's when you can blame sort of one person, then it's much easier to think that the solution is voting in Obama, right?
Yeah.
When you say that, like, well, Bush did this, and Bush did that, and Bush and Cheney and, Rumsfeld and Ashcroft. There's a name you probably haven't heard in a while.
I know.
I'm reading Matt Taibbi's book right now on criminal justice, and in his first chapter, he actually talks about how the early days of the Bush Justice Department, they actually prosecuted some white-collar criminals.
Wow.
Which, like, sounds crazy right now, because we haven't seen that happen in the last 5-6 years.
And what you remember about Ashcroft is, like, the social conservatism.
And the song.
Yeah.
I remember the song.
Let the Eagle
Yes.
Fly. Holy
Yes.
shit. Yeah. Michael Moore made good use of that.
Yeah, I remember that song. Oh, God.
Was
yeah,
Michael
Ashcroft.
Moore...
and hanging a thing over the statue because it had naked boobs.
That's right.
That
Yeah. Was speaking of Michael Moore, and we won't have to talk about him for very long, but like he's been like kind of this kind of like I don't know. He's just been there, and like one of the
he
only...
has been there. That is a good way to describe it.
Like he's
when there were not a lot of people there, he was there. You sort of watch Michael Moore movies, and you read Chomsky and you read Howard Zinn.
Yeah,
and that was what happened to you in the 90s.
These,
and
like,
then maybe
white
you packed
dudes.
up and went to Seattle. Yeah, they're definitely white dudes.
But they're like, I don't know. When I went to Occupy. Yeah. Moving through the crowds through Connie Park, there's like I saw all these lights and cameras, and I was like, oh, okay, someone's over there speaking. It'll be cool to see someone inspiring. And it was Michael Moore, and I was kind of like, you've had you've had movies out, you have like such a voice in the culture. But I just wanted to know, like, were those movies important to you growing up? Like, because those were, I think Roger and Me was shown to me in high school, and I was like, oh, labor. Like, I'd never really, you know what I mean?
I didn't see Roger and Me.
Okay.
The first time that I saw a Michael Moore movie was I was living in Colorado. After college, I moved to Denver for sort of no reason that I can coherently think of at this point, just because I wanted to live in Denver.
They got mountains there.
I wanted to live somewhere different from New Orleans. I found somewhere different from New Orleans. Didn't like it. But I was living in Colorado, and I volunteered at the Denver Film Festival when Bowling for Columbine was the big opening movie, and that was, shortly after, Columbine happened, I guess, my freshman year in college.
Yeah.
But so he had made that movie, and so I didn't really associate him with being like a big figure of the sort of labor left, such as it was.
Right.
My introduction to him was Bowling for Columbine, and he still has his sort of like working class Michigan dude shtick in that movie, certainly.
I think I just find him intriguing because he's like, for many like middle Americans, he's like literally the only person that is talking about issues like that.
And he really was at that point in time too, that like it just is crazy to me to think about like how different things are now from how things were when I was in high school, how different things were when I was in college, where being political meant wanting troops out of Iraq.
Yeah, right.
And there was I remember like when Bush wanted to privatize Social Security, and there was a whole bunch of sort of people going, don't do that, that's a terrible idea, because it turns out people like social programs that work
and that help them live.
It's weird. It's totally weird. Yeah, if Democrats actually wanted to win elections, they would maybe run on that, but they don't actually seem to want to win elections very often. So,
well, they're gonna win. They're gonna win the presidency in 2016. It seems like.
Oh God, please don't make me talk about Hillary Clinton. I just wrote an article about how we shouldn't talk about Hillary Clinton, so that's it. That's all I have to say on that subject.
Okay,
we got 2 more years before I have to figure out
what your position is on Hillary. Well,
I know what my position is on Hillary. My position is that we shouldn't talk about it.
Okay, let's not talk. let's not go to the Clintons yet. It's funny because
we do talk about presidential politics as this thing, and like it becomes that thing because we give it that weight. And like,
where do you want to direct the conversation? And I don't mean this conversation between you and I right now, but like in your work as a journalist, obviously you're not writing a lot of articles about presidential politics. You're writing about like structural stuff.
I really hope that like I will be in the middle of trying to sell a book that has nothing to do with presidential politics when the 2016 election is really heating up, and nobody will ask me to write about it.
I hope so
too.
That's
my goal in life.
Where do you wanna? Where do you think we ought to be in terms of like the major problems that are facing us today? Like you mentioned Ferguson. Ferguson seems like such a moment of like confluence between all the stuff that interests you specifically, but not just you.
I'm
but
really
you as a conduit.
sad that I don't have enough money to be there right now.
What would you be doing if you were there?
What would I be doing if I was there? Is talking to people who are from there, who are whose stories are still getting sort of mangled and told, not that great. Especially, there was a brief period where like every reporter in the country was in Ferguson, and that was sort of terrible too for a different reason.
Yeah.
And so it really is this thing where like I would like to have gone because I find all of this, compelling and necessary, and also really interesting in terms of just like the lack of any faith in elected officials to do much of anything. It keeps boiling over, and that was, a part of the Tea Party as much as it's a part
that's what I was going to think of, like
Ferguson,
it's
right?
dangerous
This idea
for the left
that,
in a sense.
Right, it's dangerous for the left to ignore it.
Yeah.
It's dangerous for the left to presume that it's only from the left.
Yeah.
And also it's dangerous for us to like write off entire swaths of the country or of people and assume that they don't have anything in common with us, because a lot of the time they have a lot of things in common with us, which has very little to do with what's going on in Ferguson. But like, what is going on there is people who have had enough and who are organizing and are actually thinking about how to organize this thing into something that lasts. And one of the things that I think is interesting about so many of these movements sort of after the financial crisis is a lot of them have sort of short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals.
Yeah.
And so you'll say like the Ohio students, right? I mean, they're a perfect example of this because they literally had 3 demands, and like one of them was like fire this cop, and one of them was talk to us about, revising your training procedures, and their big one is we really need to change the entire power relationship between the police and the people.
Yeah.
And so you're literally seeing these things where it's like, we understand that like getting this cop fired is not justice. We understand that even like rewriting the training procedures is not justice. We understand that justice is like system change.
Yeah, yeah.
And
creating a system where that doesn't happen. Yeah.
Right, right.
And not only that does it not happen, but it's not irregularly happening.
Right.
You know what I mean? Yeah.
Right. And so...
But in Ferguson, it's kind of amazing because I study the middle of the 20th century and civil rights movement and everything like that, and you have like these movements around dead black bodies, and Emmett Till is the big one in 54, but Emmett Till is really just the most visible one for us now. There were tons, and I wonder, how is that, more about Ferguson than I do, how is that community framing what has happened beyond just, it's just cops killing us? So they're connecting other issues to it, in other words. It's much wider than that. And
it's been really actually interesting to see this, because after... anytime there's some sort of big news event, you see all of these beat writers sort of coming out of the woodwork and connecting their beat to what's happening. But in this case, you would see videos of like, there's a video I have bookmarked somewhere of a young man in Ferguson who is saying like, after somebody had burned down the Quick Stop or the whatever it was, the convenience store, right? That was burned early on, and was saying like, listen, like this is about capitalism, and like using that word,
right?
And like, you would hear these, the people on the ground being interviewed saying things like, the police department exists and is funded, and the city gets its funding on fines and all of this money that they draw out of arresting people for petty crimes, that like this system is running on the criminalization of us.
And they're extracting wealth from the community through that.
Exactly. Yeah. They're extracting our wealth, and they're keeping us in this situation that we're in. And then occasionally it spills over into them just actually killing us because they can. But what's actually, so you've seen this systemic analysis, again, coming from the people on the ground, not needing to be brought in by, reporters from MSNBC or Al Jazeera or whatever.
Right.
But really being, people are not stupid and are aware of, and, somebody asked me not that long ago about the Fight for 15 and about like how these people figured out their class analysis. And I'm like, dude, you don't ever have to like ask somebody who works in a low-wage job about class. Like, they know way more about it than you ever will.
It's not something they read in a book in graduate school. It's something they're living.
You figure it find out by reading Marx when you've never had to live it.
Right.
Like, you don't need to read Marx when it's your life.
Or you just, I grew up...
reading Marx might help you think about it.
Yeah,
but, like,
right. It might give you
don't-
like a theoretical
Right.
apparatus to understand your oppression.
But it's not actually news to people.
Yeah,
that
and
this is what's happening to them.
That goes back. It makes me think of the shitty jobs thing you mentioned, because I didn't really understand race and class in a real way. And I mean, I come from the white suburbs, a relatively privileged bubble, but I got a shitty job, at a restaurant pretty early in my life, and saw where these so-called illegals, Mexicans, all the different kind of like identity categories that the town hated. I saw where they were, and I saw like how they were working, and the fact that I was in the front of the house and they were in the back of the house, and all the kind of attendant inequalities of that job. That's what made it real for me. Much more so than like even a Michael Moore movie.
Right, that you're like, oh, these are people like me, and basically the only difference between them and me is that my skin is white and my English doesn't have an accent or doesn't have a an accent that marks me as being the other.
The wrong accent.
Right, exactly. And so, I mean, and here's another thing about shitty jobs is that, like, I worked some restaurant jobs while I was in high school and college, and they sucked, and they always suck. And there's something different about them when you know that they're going to end. When you figure that, like, I'm going to get out and have this degree, and then I'm going to go get a real job, and those shitty jobs are just sort of the thing you do, a couple of days a week when you're in college.
Or it's summering from college.
When you get out, or you didn't go to college at all, and you're in that job, and suddenly you're like, shit, this might be all that there is. And like, I finished college in 2002, which happened to be recession time, and I had an English degree, which is good for absolutely nothing, and a bunch of debt.
You could always teach.
Yeah, no. And I was never good at teaching. And so, suddenly I was in this restaurant job, and suddenly it was like, shit, this might be it.
Yeah.
This might be like my life.
Right.
And that's a totally different feeling. And I've sort of gotten into it with some people who have sort of commented like, oh, it's not that hard, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, you actually have to understand this as like when this is all there is. Versus when this is like my, putting in time.
Or raising some money for summer before I go to Europe.
Right, exactly.
That's how that's how I felt about it, because it was like a corporate restaurant with a lot of white kids that were basically exactly like you're saying. They're on their way to something better, and they're like, oh, I'm just raising money to go this or here or there, and the people in the back are there, raising money for their children and have really no option beyond that job.
In this country.
And
in their country, they might have been... one of the restaurant jobs I had, I remember this couple who I worked with who were from Peru, and they were college professors back in Peru. And here in the U.S., they were bussing tables.
Yeah, that's kind of a stereotype about the like cab driver that tells you I was a doctor in my home country, but that's like a real thing. It's
thank you,
NAFTA.
Thank you, American policy, for doing that to those people. And not that there's anything wrong with bussing tables for a living. Hell, sometimes it can be fun. But like, when these are the jobs that exist, and this is what we're seeing now with the fast food organizing and the Walmart organizing, and like when these, and the home care workers organizing, right? Home care work is like the fastest growing job in this country. When these are the jobs that exist, and you're looking at this being your life, then your choice is to organize or be in a miserable job for the rest of your life. And your choice is to get political.
What is the home care? Why is that expanding?
Well, there was this thing called the baby boom. And
wait, when did that happen?
There was this thing called the baby boom after World War II. That those people are getting old. And
you're talking about care of the elderly.
Oh yeah,
yeah. Okay.
Most of
I was imagining like Caribbean nannies. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Like
Well, there's particularly home health care workers are the one that is growing. I mean, domestic work in general is growing and bigger, and comes with a whole bunch of problems, but specifically this kind of home health care work, partly because baby boomers are just getting older, partly because we deinstitutionalized a lot of this kind of care, rather than putting people in a home, which is often miserable. You say, oh, well, they could stay at their own home, and they could live in their surroundings where they are, and they can have family come visit them there and be more independent and generally have a life that they would rather live if they just had a little bit of help, and they have somebody who comes in to, and home healthcare workers do everything from administer medication to help people get out of bed and into a wheelchair to helping people bathe and eat, to providing emotional support for somebody who spends most of their day alone. It's really intense work, and it's really low paid work. And in a lot of states, it's paid for by Medicaid and Medicare.
Is it done disproportionately by women? It's
done disproportionately by women of color, many of them immigrants. And do you think that might have something to do with why they're all paid very little?
Yeah, none of it's surprising.
I know you're so shocked that racism and sexism plays a part in how wages are determined.
Well, that's what I think is interesting about Ferguson, is kind of like you're seeing this kind of, like I said, a confluence of this stuff. And how much do you think that Ferguson is really centered on race, and how much is it kind of like combining race and class?
Well, I mean, this country has combined race and class, right? This country sort of created, the concept of race as we know it, in order to have a population of either, completely free and captive labor, or, the very low paid labor.
Right.
That was always exploitable and always expendable. And you can't extract those two things in this country. No matter how much people try and say, well, we just have to talk about race, or we just have to talk about class.
Right, right.
There are certainly things like, cabs not stopping for people of color, whether or not, they don't know whether you're rich or not.
Right.
There are certainly things that sort of happen because, I read Barbara and Karen Field's Racecraft, and now I constantly try to say, not say that like these things happen because people are black, because they happen because somebody's racist.
Yes,
they happen because racism, not because black. Right?
No,
The color of your skin does not make a cab not stop for you. The cab driver thinking that you are going to have to go to Bed-Stuy or Bushwick or the Bronx, and that you probably won't tip because a cab driver has racist ideas in his head.
Those are important. Those are important linguistic things to say. I think
that book really blew my mind. Everybody should read it.
Yeah, it came up on a previous episode of this podcast, and I don't know if it's that book, but it's one of a few different books that are kind of this turn in just the way we talk about slavery. Like it goes back to that ontological thing of like, are you a feminist or not? People not talking about people as slaves, but as enslaved people. You know what I mean? Like this person is not a slave. Right. They're a person that's a human being that's experienced a condition of slavery.
Right. And we do this in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
And back to the sort of question of, are you a feminist, is also like, are you a racist becomes this thing in a way that like we try to sort of disavow. Well, I don't use the N-word, so I'm not a racist. Well, like it's not really how it works.
Ugly.
And but we have that concept, and I think that a lot of what's happened in recent years, certainly since Trayvon Martin, certainly Ferguson is adding a whole other level to this, is that we're starting to realize that like that's actually not how racism works. That racism actually works because you have an entire population of people who, once again, you can kill with impunity, you will throw in jail at like the slightest whatever, who are systematically targeted for subprime mortgages, for instance, and then
it reinforces all of that.
Have those taken away,
and it makes it all like the racist joke of like or the shitty language of someone like do you have to go? Sorry.
No.
Like someone like the stupid Don Sterling thing the previous year,
right?
But like locating racism in the guy that says the N-word is like, lets the whole thing
off
the
hook. Don Sterling
hook.
himself was a property owner who had been charged with, God, I forget the details on it.
He was like a slumlord,
right? He was a slumlord who had specifically been sued for racial discrimination, and like, that was okay.
That's the racism that matters. You know what I mean?
Right, the racism that like most of these major league sports owners, when we talk about that language, are billionaire white men, and most of the players who play for them are working class brown and black men. Hi guys, let's talk about racism.
Right.
You want to really talk about racism? We have to talk about the whole apparatus of major league sports.
Can we talk about football a little bit?
We can talk about football.
Because the NFL is all of a sudden, in the news all of a sudden.
All of a sudden.
But there is like this kind of like it seems like a growing consciousness about how important these institutions are and how important they are for shaping cultural attitudes.
Well, like, I like to write about sports labor issues,
and you're
right?
a hockey fan,
because
so,
I'm a hockey fan, and I've written pieces about hockey lockouts and how Jeremy Jacobs is the worst person in the world, even for major league sports owners. And he's the owner of the Boston Bruins, for those of you who are
Gary Bettman still the commissioner?
Gary Bettman is still the commissioner. Gary Bettman is also the worst.
He gets booed everywhere he goes.
Gary Bettman gets booed everywhere he goes, and I enjoy it so much. He's terrible.
He's a little troll.
Oh, God, he's the worst. But, like, so, right, the way that, like, the hockey lockout is the most high-profile labor action going on in the country when it is happening. Yeah. And that is a way to actually explain, like, here's why this matters. Here's why you should, in fact, care that, like, these guys who get pretty well paid for what they do, which is basically risk their life for your entertainment every night.
Yes. Gladiator style.
Right. Yeah. They are up against literally the 1% of the 1%, right? To be a major league sports owner, you are a billionaire. And yeah, it's actually a way to sort of explain that. Or the best one recently was the NFL refs lockout last year, right? Because that was like you couldn't have that argument that like, oh, well, like Sidney Crosby's a bad example because Sidney Crosby was a union buster. I want you all to know that. Sidney Crosby was a union buster. Ryan Miller, on the other hand. Anyway. And you didn't have that argument of like, they're rich, so why should we care about their union?
Right. Yeah, the refs aren't rich.
That these refs were like getting paid nothing and we're getting stomped on. I think Dave Zirin and Mike Elk wrote a piece about it and called it like using an Uzi on a field mouse. You know, you're literally union busting the refs that made, you know, $40,000 a year.
That's all they make, really?
I don't remember exactly the numbers. Don't quote me on that.
Yeah.
It might be wrong, but they also don't work the full year, but like they made so little money compared to what the billionaires who run the sport and how much money the sport makes.
What consciousness is there of that in among like NFL fans? Do you think NFL fans react to that? Because do you feel like some people are just kind of like mad that there's not a season, you know, or that things are delayed?
The thing about the refs lockout was like there was a season and you were watching it happen and you were watching these replacement refs be terrible.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You were watching like the scab refs be so awful that like Scott Walker, governor of Wisconsin, did take union rights away from like all of his public employees other than the cops and firefighters because they're men.
And they're heroes. Let's be straight. No. Let's just
John Kasich's big mistake in Ohio, man. Yeah, right.
And then John Kasich was a Fox News host, wasn't he? Like he was the guy that like replaced Bill O'Reilly.
Right. Well, John Kasich's big mistake was including the firefighters and the cops in his anti-union bill. But back to the NFL, the scab refs.
Yes.
Scott Walker actually said on Twitter, like, bring the refs back, give them whatever they want. Because this is so bad. Because you were watching it happen and you were watching these people be incompetent and realizing like, oh, being a ref in this sport is really hard.
You need skills that you should be compensated for. Yeah.
You are responsible for the lives of a whole bunch of people. Like, this is sort of serious. Especially for a sport that, well, you know, still won't acknowledge its complicity in, you know, life-threatening head injuries, but whatever.
Well, there's that. I think that a lot of people have been turned off by the NFL in terms of the life-threatening head injury thing. Seems like the owners of the NFL are like they're acting like the cigarette company owners during the 90s. You know what I mean? They're covering up the kind of like medical difficulties that accompany the thing they're selling. You know what I mean? Yeah. And there's also, I mean, just the outright kind of misogyny that's built into the NFL. There's Sam, the first like openly gay NFL player,
Michael Sam.
Yeah, Michael Sam. So and then that with the like incredible amount of like sexual assaults and rapes that are perpetrated by these dudes, and not only that, but like how the NFL react. It seems like there's like the NFL is another one of those institutions undergoing this kind of magnifying lens on it.
Well, I think we're in a moment where we're realizing that like all of these institutions are built on the same foundations, which are capitalism and patriarchy. But like, and all of those institutions have the same sort of rotten foundations, right? That like, you have to actually grapple with the idea that we have this sport that we love to watch, and I still watch it, and I feel guilty watching it, but I still sit down on Sunday and watch football.
Yeah.
And like, these are these institutions.
What do you
that
get
we
out
love.
of it? Why do you
we
watch
love
it?
And I think sports are amazing. I think watching people do something that they're really, really amazing at is great. Watching these dudes like leap, 10 feet into the air and catch something that's flying at them, it's amazing.
Yeah.
And like I think that that's a really human thing that we all connect to in some way or other. And these things are built in a way that is deeply screwed up, and it is deeply screwed up because of the profit motives, and it's deeply screwed up because the class and race structures of our society,
and the military stuff
set
that's
it
in
up
it too.
to be that way. And so we assume that like that's football's problem. Well, it doesn't have to be football's problem. It's capitalism's problem, and we could actually have sports that didn't rely on young, mostly men of color, putting their lives on the line and sort of accepting that the average career is like 2.5 years, and they may never be, really fully functional again after that. And damn it,
bone.
and that the price you pay for that is not actually in many cases millions and millions of dollars. The price you get is the average salary is like $500,000 or so. I mean, last year the quarterback who won the Super Bowl made $600 and something thousand. Like,
and that's gonna
this
last.
Was not.
You're not gonna be making that money your whole life.
And Russell Wilson is making much more than that now.
Right.
But last year, Russell Wilson and Richard Sherman, who is the everybody paid attention to Richard Sherman, and we should, because Richard Sherman is awesome. These guys were making $600,000 a year, which is like it's a lot of money still, but it's not remotely enough if that actually if Russell Wilson got injured in last year's Super Bowl.
Yeah.
And that was the end of his career.
Right.
That is not enough money to live on.
No, of course not. And Richard Sherman, the guy that you just mentioned, isn't he the guy that like people like freaked out because he he was like acted like some grotesque savage? At least that was the story.
Yeah, they were so horrified by him. Meanwhile, the guy is like a brilliant speaker and just like went on all of these TV shows and just like ruined people's lives. It's amazing.
Great.
I love him. And he's wrote this wonderful piece about oh my goodness, I forget who the guy is. A friend of his who is also a football player who was accused of having gang ties or something. And Richard Sherman wrote this wonderful piece that was out. Oh God, I forget where. I'm so bad at all this.
That's all right.
This is why I'm a journalist. I verify everything. Wrote this wonderful piece about sort of coming from where he came from and being a guy who grew up in this neighborhood where you knew a lot of people who were in gangs, and you don't abandon where your family is from because you got lucky enough to be good at football and get out, and this idea that like, and actually, and like called out some of these owners for like some owner who had like gotten into a car accident while drunk or something like that, and like really was just like, how come he's not a thug? How come he's not a like?
Oh, it's part of that language, right? It's part of that structure.
Richard Sherman, by the way, has amazing class and race analysis and is the best, and is so much smarter than all these scumbag owners.
Well, not only scumbag owners, but just media figures and everything. And that's I wanted to ask you like maybe
Richard Sherman forever.
Maybe one last thing before we go here is
we're not going to end on my love for Richard Sherman.
We'll see how it comes out in the editing room.
Okay.
But I do want to ask you about like the other side of this, because you say you're writing about. I agree with you, and I think partially I started this podcast to kind of reflect on, where the left has been over the last 50 years and kind of how...
It's an interesting question.
And how right now we are, I do believe, I accept your hypothesis that, we're in a kind of special moment in terms of social justice and everything that's happening around that. But there's also a reactionary side. You're talking about like the rise of the Tea Party. Like, who has the upper hand right now? I mean, the reactionary side of it seems like they control a lot of the culture. You know what I mean? And I mean that like...
What's really interesting is that I think that there's a big difference between who... When people say the Tea Party, I asked Twitter one night sort of where the Tea Party was, because we hadn't heard much about like big Tea Party rallies or anything. Right. And like the answers that I got showed me that there are like 3 or 4 different things that people mean when they say the Tea Party. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I'm not talking about Scott Walker. Scott Walker's a Republican hack who would have been a Republican hack whether or not there was a thing that was called the Tea Party. Right? Scott Walker has been a Republican hack for a long ass time, and Scott Walker is going to continue to be a Republican hack, probably even after hopefully he loses in November. And let's just hope that happens.
Yeah, he
because Count Walker is
capitalized
terrible.
on energy that was
Right.
not his.
And like the Koch brothers, everybody's favorite villain, right? But in general, rich people, or dare we say capital, has been capital for a very long time. And those people have had the political views that they have had for a long time. And they've worked very hard to take over politics. And Kim Phillips Fine wrote a wonderful book about that. So if you want to talk about where the, where things have gone in the last half century, that everybody should read, called Invisible Hands. Anyway,
nice. Invisible Hands with an S? Nice.
Yeah. I'll show it to you.
And then there's a third.
And then there's actually this thing where you had a lot of people who were pissed that there were bank bailouts and what the hell is going on here, and they sort of blamed Obama, which is not entirely unfair.
Right.
And also were people who had sort of spent their life being fed this line that essentially, like, you are the middle class and you're hardworking and you deserve what you get, and then there are those poor people. And those, black poor people mostly, right? That, like, these same people probably wouldn't say that out loud.
Yeah, they would whisper it.
They would whisper it.
Yeah, I have family members that whisper people's races
right,
to me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But that they would, dog, what are you eating?
It's gross. Whatever it is.
It's gross.
It's gross.
Anyway. And they suddenly, like, in tandem with going like, oh my God, you're bailing out all the rich people, are also like, oh my God, and now there's a black president and I don't know what to do with that.
Right.
And this really muddled, kind of racist, kind of horrific thing comes out of that, which is like, but a lot of people reacting to the same things that we're reacting to.
Yeah. No,
And,
so you're saying it's like confused politics.
It's very confused politics. It's a very, very, very confused politics. And I mean, I think a lot of the left is also a very confused politics.
Sure,
right? If you wandered around at Occupy, you'd see people in End the Fed jackets and whatever. Like, there's not a lot of coherence to all of this. And I think who has the upper hand is going to depend a lot on the left being able to make coherent arguments about sort of who we are, where we are, and what we want in a way that is starting to be done. I was just listing the Ohio students and the a lot of the movement on the ground in Ferguson, and a lot of in a lot of places I'm seeing people actually sort of start to struggle with these ideas and actually start to come up with demands and structures of what this is and or answers to those questions. And the right is trying to do that too. And the but I do actually separate sort of this like on the ground nebulous thing that, like, the guy, what is his name, that beat Eric Cantor, right? Yeah. Who, on the one hand is saying, like,
college professor?
horrifically racist things about immigrants.
Yeah.
On the other hand is lambasting Eric Cantor for having the names of all the bankers that got bailed out in his Rolodex. And like, that's a politics that we have to grapple with. Yeah,
the populist energy on both sides.
Right, and understand like what that is and what, if anything, good we can make come out of it. If like some of those people might agree with us more than with that guy, but like that's what they are seeing and that's what they're hearing.
Yeah, I agree.
And there's nobody else there. And so I tend to be hopeful on that subject. I was raised by Republicans, so I tend to not think that they're the devil. And I think that there are people who you can win over, and there are places where we can actually agree. And like, there are also things that are really, really hard that we have to actually grapple with in a real honest way. And most of those are questions of race and gender. Yeah. And we really, really, really need to get better at talking about and dealing with that, because otherwise the left is screwed.
So identity politics up front for you in terms of the...
I don't call it identity politics, because like my existence in this world as a woman is shaped for me whether I like it or not.
Yeah, right.
It's not a choice that I can identify with or not. It's not what I define myself as. It's what society defines me as.
Yeah, so
like we were
I am a feminist,
about,
I am a woman, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I am what society thinks I am based on what I look like when I walk down the street. And that until we actually create a society that doesn't do that to people, I don't get a choice about my identity politics.
Yeah. It seems like one of the,
like we were talking about the racism in the cab driver, right?
Right.
Like you don't get a choice to just opt out of identity politics because identity politics happens to you.
Well, I think that's why, what you're talking about is rhetorical work in a sense. And that's why it's good that you're a journalist. It seems to fit like with your perspective on how politics moves, because it's like, it's about kind of
I think politics moves in the street, and I just try to be there when it's happening.
But it needs, there are different branches of it too, you know what I mean? Like there's the street aspect of it, but it can't be just street. There has to be, and I wouldn't call it theory, but there has to be a kind of articulation. I
don't think theory is a bad word. I think the idea that only certain people theorize is the problem.
Yes.
Not that theory is a thing, right?
Or get to theorize.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Like the guy in that video that I mentioned earlier from Ferguson is absolutely theorizing. Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
We just, your average whoever wouldn't call that what he was doing, but of course he was.
Well, that famous video of that Marine, that like black Marine yelling at the cops at Occupy.
Shamar Thomas, yeah.
That dude is theorizing. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Like 100% and like combining.
Right? And we need to understand that is what is happening, and that theory sort of, and, you know more about this than I do, I'm sure you study this stuff, but the left for a long time sort of got trapped in the academy, and it's very easy to think that what we have to do is sort of win these intellectual arguments and then we'll win. And if that was true, we would have won already, but we're not winning because only 5 people are listening to this or reading that, you know?
The academy has such a high view of itself and thinking that they'll be at the front of whatever revolution. Yeah.
Right.
Right. These are elite institutions though. And it's it's the feeling that when the revolution comes, it'll come when they approve it,
Right. And I do what I do because I think it matters. Absolutely. But I do what I do and identify as a journalist because what I think my job is like I said, to be there when things are going on and to try to be able to put that in context.
Yeah.
Context, as Lynn Washington, one of my wonderful journalism professors, would always say. I hear that in his voice, and he has this wonderful, very deep voice. He would be an excellent guest for your podcast, actually. The context.
Send me an email.
Context is your job as a journalist.
And that appeals to me as a historian a lot.
Exactly.
It's like feeling
it's very similar,
this
right?
story is not without a lot of context and a lot of surrounding elements that are basically the whole story.
Right.
Exactly. I really appreciate you sitting down with me. I really appreciate you writing. Thank you so much.